So we're picking up in chapter 26 with the Great Migration, and this was, of course, caused by the pressure of population. So there was this sort of touching element of the human drama that was interwoven with this economic expansion, and that was that millions of people uprooted their families and left their homelands to pursue this migration, and this became a central part of Western expansion. European birth rates eventually declined in the 19th century, but so did death rates, and that was mainly because of the rising standard of living and, of course, the medical revolution. So even though there were lower birth rates, the population of Europe still grew dramatically. Between 1800 and 1900, they went from 188 million to 432 million. And then between 1815 and 1932, more than 60 million people left Europe. And they migrated mostly to areas of European settlement like North and South America, Australia, New Zealand, some to Siberia for some reason, where they contributed to growth in those areas. But Europe's population increase put pressure on the land and led to land hunger and overpopulation. And so most places, migration increased 20 years, or about 20 years after that rapid growth in population. And so this outflow of migrants was really a defining characteristic of European society for this period. And even that varied differently for different countries, but the United States did absorb the largest overall number of European immigrants, but still fewer than half of all migrants went to the United States. So European migrants were usually small farmers or skilled artisans, and their purpose for migrating was just that they were trying to stay ahead of poverty, pretty much. Migrants did tend to be a great asset to the countries that received them. Most of them were young, unmarried, in the prime of life, and just ready to work hard in their new land. And it's important to note that many of them were migrants instead of immigrants. That is, they returned home after some time abroad. Ties to family, ties to friends played a crucial role in the movement of people. Many times in any given village, they would settle together in like rural enclaves or like tightly knit urban neighborhoods. Most of them left looking for better opportunity, but there were a considerable amount of European men and women who had to leave because of the spirit of revolt and independence in their own country. Migration did slow down, though, as people began to win basic political and social reforms, like the right to vote or equality before the law. Asian migrants. So there was a substantial number of Chinese, Japanese, Indians, and Filipinos who responded to hardship with either temporary or permanent migration. And most of them ended up being indentured servants, working under incredibly difficult conditions, either in gold mines or on plantations. And they really didn't tend to stay there long. They tried to flee the plantation or the gold mine as soon as possible. And they would tend to look for better opportunities in either in trade or in towns. And of course, many times they came into conflict with the local populations who demanded their governments to enact discriminatory laws. In America and Australia, they were called the Great White Walls, and these laws were just put into place to keep Asians out. By and large, the Europeans reaped the main benefits from the Great Migration. Western imperialism, 1880 to 1914, and we'll look first at European presence in Africa before 1880. The expansion of Western society really reached its high point between about 1880 and 1914. And between those years, the leading European nations sent streams of migrants, money, manufactured goods all over the world, but they also wanted to enlarge or create vast political empires abroad. And this new imperialism was aimed primarily at Asia and Africa. But prior to 1880, European nations controlled only about 10% of the African continent. And the only inhabitation there, at the southern tip of the continent, the British had taken land from the Dutch at their settlement at Cape Town, which of course led the Dutch cattle ranchers and the farmers to move to the interior, where they had to fight some of the tribes there. But by the 1880s, the Afrikaner settlers, who were the descendants of the Dutch in that colony, and the British settlers, who pretty much hated each other, had taken control of most of South Africa, from the Zulu, I guess it's the Kosha, I'm not sure how that's said, I think it's an A on the end, and other tribes. But they had taken possession of South Africa from those people. So you also have the French in Algeria, the British and the Afrikaners in the south, a couple of trading posts that pretty sparsely dotted the coasts, and then the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique. But other than that, Africa was largely free of Westerners, and that was until 1880, when the scramble for Africa began. Okay, so between 1880 and 1900, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy scrambled for African possessions, almost like their national livelihoods depended on it. And they did that until the entire continent of Africa had been carved up and put under European rule. There was only in Ethiopia, in northeast Africa, were they able to fight off Italian invaders, and then Liberia, which had been settled by free slaves from the United States, remained independent. But other than that, that continent was carved up by Europeans. So the British, led by a guy named Cecil Rhodes, pretty much jumped over the two Afrikaner states and eventually conquered the Dutch in the bloody South African War. And this took place between 1899 and 1902. And again, the bloody South African War, the British were fighting the Dutch, and ultimately the old Afrikaner territories were united with the old Cape Colony in a new Union of South Africa. And this new union was largely a self-governing colony, but eventually the defeated Afrikaners were able to use their numerical superiority to very slowly take political power. So on top of that, you have the British occupation of Egypt in 1882, King Leopold II of Belgium, who was a very energetic and strong-willed monarch who lusted for distant territory and had his sights set on Central Africa. So King Leopold sent Henry Stanley to the Congo Basin, and Stanley was able to set up trade stations, sign quote-unquote treaties with African chiefs, and basically plant Leopold's flag. So eventually the Berlin Conference was held 1884, 1885 to set up this principle that the European claims to this African territory had to rest on effective occupation. So that was the rule. In order to claim a territory, you have to actually be there in order for your claim to be recognized by other states. In the mid-80s, Germany established protectorates over many small African kingdoms and tribes in Togo, the Cameroons region, Southwest Africa, and later even in East Africa. The French, who already were occupying Algeria, moved southward and eastward from the Senegal. They moved northward from their protectorate on the Congo River to take more land. The British began enlarging their West African enclaves, and they pushed northward from the Cape Colony and westward from Zanzibar. But the interesting thing that happened with them was with Egypt. The British attempted to move southward from Egypt and to try to take Sudan. And Sudan, they were blocked by fiercely independent Muslims who massacred a British force in 1885. Well, about 10 years later, another British force met them again, where 11,000 Muslim tribesmen were basically raised by the newly invented Maxim machine gun in a battle, again, that killed 11,000 Muslim tribesmen, but only killed 28 Britons. So the British conquest of Sudan really exemplifies the general process of empire building in Africa, and that was this. All native people who resisted European rule were blown away by vastly superior military forces. Imperialism in Asia. So the Dutch in 1815 ruled the tiny island of Java in the East Indies, but they gradually brought almost all of the 3,000-mile archipelago under their political authority. And then in the 1880s, the French took Indochina, and of course, India, Japan, and China also experienced this imperialist impact. Even Russia, imperialist Russia, conquered Muslim areas to the south in the Caucasus and in Central Asia, and then proceeded to try to greedily take some of China's outlying provinces in the Far East in the 1890s. And of course, the great conquest for the United States during this time was the Philippines, which were taken from the Spanish in 1898 after the Spanish-American War. So what were the causes of this new imperialism? Of course, there were economic motives that played an important role in the extension of these empires, especially in the British Empire, because the British were beginning to lose their early lead in industrialization and were facing increasing competition in foreign markets. And so, when continental powers began to grab territory in Asia and Africa in the 80s, the British followed suit immediately, fearing that France and Germany would seal off their empires with high tariffs and that all of their future economic opportunities would be gone forever. Some people were convinced that colonies were essential to great nations, and this is an attitude that reflects both European nationalism and social Darwinism. The idea of the brutal competition among the races. Another factor was the industrial world's unprecedented technological and military superiority. And this, of course, was evidenced in Sudan by the British with the lethal Maxim machine gun, the use of quinine in controlling the attacks of malaria, and the steamship, not to mention the international telegraph. There were also conservative leaders in countries who thought that imperialism was a national necessity, and they used that to justify what they were doing and to hold on to their power. And finally, there were just certain special interest groups in each nation that were powerful agents of expansion. For one, shipping companies who wanted lucrative subsidies. There were white settlers who demanded more land. There were missionaries who wanted to spread religion. And then military men even who sought rapid advancement. So these were some of the causes of this new imperialism. So that brings us to a civilizing mission. Imperialists developed some additional arguments to satisfy their consciences and to, sort of give an answer to their critics. And the idea was that Europeans could and should, quote, civilize these more primitive non-white people. And many Americans accepted this and called it the white man's burden, believing that their civilization had reached its heights and they had great benefits to bestow on all less advanced people. And another argument was that the imperial government protected natives from tribal warfare. They protected them from themselves. as well as maybe worse forms of exploitation by other white settlers and business people. But, peace and stability under European control did facilitate the spread of Christianity, as Catholic and Protestant missionaries tried to find converts and usually used the school as their means to spread the gospel. So what did the critics of imperialism have to say? Well, one of the most popular critics was a guy named J.A. Hobson, and he wrote Imperialism following the very unpopular South African War. And this was a forceful attack on the expansion of empire. He said that the economic needs of unregulated capitalism motivated this rush to gain colonies. But he argued that these colonial possessions, didn't even pay off economically for the country as a whole. And really, it was only the unscrupulous interest groups, the special interest groups, that profited from this. And it was at the expense of the European taxpayer and, of course, the natives. And his other main criticism was that the quest for empire diverted attention away from domestic reform, fixing the problems at home. And really this, and the criticism of others, really struck home with many people. This was moral condemnation of whites imperiously ruling non-whites. And those who did buy into the white man's burden mentality were tagged as racist bullies, whose rule rested on brutality and racial contempt and the machine gun. Another one of these critics was a guy named Joseph Conrad from Poland, and he reprimanded the pure selfishness of Europeans in, quote, civilizing Africa. And really the critics were arguing that this was a degrading double standard, because at home Europeans had won or were winning representative government, individual liberties, equality of opportunity in some instances, but in their colonies they were imposing military dictatorships on Africans and Asians and discriminating against them shamelessly. So we'll go ahead and bring our video lecture to a close.